Welcome back from this break. We hope that you had the moment to take a coffee or a tea or just a little break, but just a really little one, because we must get back into the action. Today, just to recall, is everything about cooperation, collaboration, and community. And if there is a topic that is suitable and topical for us, it is?
Open source.
And that's what we are discussing now. There is no open source without community, and I dare say there is no real public service community without open source, and that's what we are discussing now. The next session will be moderated by another of my beloved colleagues from our team on interoperability in the Commission, from Monika Sowinska. She is yet another multi-talent coming out of private business, coming out of a member state, moving into the EU. And something that I liked in her short bio, she says she has a can-do attitude. And it's not a can-do attitude, because what she can do already also gets done. Monika, before we kick over to you and we kick over to our panel on this, the title is The Role of Open Source in the Public Sector. And if you allow me to say, the role of open source in the public sector is massive. And it is massively underestimated. And it is ours, it is yours collectively to grab. Monika, over to you.
Thank you, Max. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
I can't agree with you more. Thanks a lot for this kind introduction and introduction to our session. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this session. I am very excited to see so many of you. Some practical information that you probably heard. We won't be able to answer your chat questions directly during the session. If you want to ask something, our panelists, it's the best to contact them via chat function of the platform, or if you ask it in Zoom, maybe you will be lucky and one or two questions we will answer at the end of the session. So let me now introduce and warmly welcome our panelists, starting with Sachiko Muto, who is Chief Executive Officer at Open Forum Europe, which is a Brussels-based think tank promoting open technologies. In her work, Sachiko seeks broad collaboration from across industry and community to research and communicate the benefits of open technologies. Our next panelist, Bastien Guerry, is a long-time free software hacktivist who joined the French public administrations 4 years ago, thanks to a public innovation program called Public Interest Entrepreneurs. In 2018, he joined Etalab at DINUM, that is Interministerial Directorate for Digital Services, where he leads the efforts of French public agencies towards publishing their source code, using more software and contributing to the open source ecosystem. Leonardo Favario is the open source project leader in the digital transformation department, part of the Italian government, a free and open source software developer and enthusiast since a very young age. He is now focusing on the national open source strategy in order to create sustainable communities in the public sector, a topic very close to my heart, I must say. Finally, Yanis Tupoulis, who has been a business manager in software and infrastructure companies for around 20 years. He's an all open source enthusiast who is very active in the field. Today, Yanis is representing the Latvian Open Source Technology Association as chairman of the board. Once again, a very welcome to all of you. I was going to start our discussion on the role of open source in the public sector with a few introductory words. But I realized that actually all sessions so far were proving the importance of open source. So maybe we don't have that much to discuss. But what is more, I realized that the Commission Han already did this job, the whole job for me yesterday while opening our conference. Let me quote him. Open source is a force of good. The solutions of tomorrow must be built using public code. This is not only to ensure a sound use of public money, but also to promote freedom of choice and avoid vendor lock-in. With open source, we can use and reuse software solutions, pool efforts, and get much more bang from the buck when we invest in digital transformation of our public administrations. End quote. You can hear from this last sentence that our commission is also responsible for the budget, and he recognizes the value of good investment. And I also guess that this is music to your ears, my panelists. So let's hear your thoughts on the subject. I would like you, in 90 seconds, each of you, answer my question: what is the main role of open source in the public sector? Leonardo, let's start with you, and please remember, you have 90 seconds.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, I, as you know, and as all the panelists and other people know, I'd always like to highlight the benefits of open source, being transparency, being increased security, being a generation of innovation. However, today I'd like to focus on something slightly different, which is, from my perspective, the fact that open source allows public administrations to become better clients. So, you know, free and open source allows for accurate accountability of the vendors. And this makes it possible not only to have, you know, the protection of their investment, but always to have more interoperable solutions. So I think that if we are able in each of our member states and as the European Union as a whole to create an ecosystem of suppliers, being both developers, maintainers, or service providers, we are able to, from one side, protect from vendor lock-in, and from the other one, to generate a return of investment, a multiplied return of investment. So I think this is really focal and crucial for the next years to come.
So you follow our commissioner, you know, return on investment, very important aspect. Bastien, your turn now.
Yeah, thank you, Monica. I would say that the role of free software, the main role of free software in public sector, is really to help with the digital emancipation of public ministries and agencies. So the same way the single most powerful idea behind the free software movement is to give more choices to software users, open source within the public sector should help public agencies take better ownership of their IT at all levels, be it infrastructure, services, or products. So to help with this emancipation, free software help agencies achieving their digitalization more efficiently and to support their efforts towards more transparency for the citizens. So yeah, that would be my take on this.
Thank you very much. Yanis, could we hear your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I would say a couple more general things. First of all, I think that it's not a coincidence we are talking about open source in public administration. At least in Latvia, I see a demand from citizens for government to be more open. For example, sometimes there are some questionable procurement cases where we need to just openly say what's going on to citizens. Or another example from pandemic times, that initially our cabinet of ministers met with closed doors, and then thanks to the push from general public, now their sittings are open. And the other thing is that open source doesn't mean just open source software. We are talking here only. We are opening more things like hardware designs or any other creative work could be basically opened. And now back to the open source software. At least how I see it from Latvian perspective, its main role is to boost innovation, basically. So, and I hope we will talk about that during this session. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. So you and we all agree that all well-known facets of open source, such as openness, first, contribution to diversity, innovation, make it indispensable means for digital transformation and modernization of the public sector. However, I would like to dig a bit in the concept that is called by some organizations the open source way. As you know, and as you mentioned. So I think I skip our one panelist, which I
Usually it's
realized.
last but not least.
Yeah,
but,
that was
okay.
actually my finally. Let's
Yeah.
move to. Sorry, because this is like a big mistake of the moderator. Yeah, that we
No
have
worries.
different glitches at online events. I would really love to be with you in one room. That would never happen. Sorry, and Sashiko, please, your turn.
Yeah, thank you, Monica. And you know, I could be a bit cheeky here and sort of echo Max and Monica and say that, you know, open source is a key enabler to everything that we're discussing during these 3 days. But if I were to make, or you know, you've asked me to just make one point, and that would really be to emphasize how open source really allows us to focus our resources on the innovative layer. And I think this has been recognized a lot in the private sector and is the reason why it has really taken off there. And I think the public sector has even more to benefit, even more to gain from this. And, you know, so for the European public sector, it means that we could focus our limited resources, and I'm talking skills, time, you know, financial resources, are really on customizing the digital services that we need, instead of building from scratch, in theory, 27 times. And I think, you know, it's not necessarily about cost saving, but it's really about sort of focusing on that innovation, which ultimately would provide us with the same resources to go further and, you know, and deliver more innovative services for the citizens. So sorry for holding you back a bit, Monica, but that was my introduction.
It's great, and thanks for adding this aspect again on innovation. So we could actually say that, and that's what you are saying, that the public sector has actually much more to gain than the private sector, because there is no competition in public sector. Yeah. So we can really focus on results and on collaboration, and it can give Europe a competitive edge, you know, our economy, because we pool resources, we work together, and we build on existing things, and we collaborate. So this is a very important message. So let's look now at those values that are cooperation, collaboration, transparency, that are elements of open source, the open source way. And the French public administration is, in terms of you know, policies and certain actions, it's actually quite advanced when it comes to use and promotion of open source in the public sector. So we would like to hear, Bastien, how it is done, how those principles are implemented in practice in your organization and in all public bodies that you cooperate with and where you promote the use of open source.
Yeah, as you said, we have a very good legal framework to let administrations publish their source code, and they are all encouraged to use more free software. If I take the example of my own administration, like the Interministerial Directorate for Digital Technology, open source has been used as a natural feature of the Agile methodology since 2015. And generally, it helps diffusing a sense of accountability and resilience, thinking about upward and downward dependencies. So this is not just about innovation. This is also about thinking about maintenance and the future. So today we push in two directions, because I would say that administrations, they do compete. They compete for money sometimes, and they compete for attracting the best people within their walls. So we're pushing two directions, which are looking upfront whether new public services can use existing free software solutions and rely on the French and beyond the French ecosystem. open source ecosystem of companies providing this free software, and also promoting the reuse of the source code for these new services, because we have a long list of repositories that we publish, more than 7,000 repositories, but we need to make it easier to know what we can reuse, and I hope we can work with public code from Italy. That is a very nice project helping with this. So for instance, if I had to give two small examples, instead of reinventing the single sign-on software, we use Leonardo and Keycloak intensively, and public sector contributes to these projects. Also, we built Démarche Simplifiée, an application to help with the dematerialization of administrative forms and procedures. So it was deployed for central administrations only, but because it was open source, then French association Adulact has been able to deploy it for local public agencies. So mutualization upstream and downstream.
Okay, so collaboration, and you use the word competition in different sense. But what you are going to do, you just try to pool resources and put people together and work together, and also across border, from what we hear, with other administrations, which is actually the ideas we've been promoting for years under the ISA Square program. So very happy to hear that, and thank you for sharing it with us. And what about Blue Hats, Bastien? I know that it's your Keith, your favorite project, and also fits very well in this the open source way and collaboration.
So this is Blue Hats. This is something that we wear just to mention that we all work for the public interest, whether we are from within the administration or companies contributing to the open source movement. So we started Blue Hats 2 years ago with this idea that we need to put together the people who are sensitive to these core values that are shared between public sector agencies and outsiders, companies, associations, and so on. So Blue Hats for now is we have workshops, mostly technical workshops. We had like 14 workshops in the last year with people sharing their technical expertise on how they use open source, how they contribute to it, how they deploy solutions. So it's really technical focus and bringing people together, but it's not just technical. We also have people dealing with procurement, legal stuff, and general discussions. And this is a nice small community in France. Blue Hat is not a trademark, so any country is welcome to use this as a way to put people together, because upstream and downstream collaboration is really a hard task, and I think we have a lot of progress ahead of us for that.
Thank you. So this is one more initiatives that you really implement, and you incorporate those values in your work. The reports on open source policies and initiatives in 28 European countries published by Open Source Observatory, that I am also today representing, that we published last year, showed that the situation is not homogeneous when it comes to adoption of open source, because the picture that we can paint, and we're listening to Bastien, for example, it sounds quite attractive, but even in the administrations that you have well-established policies, guidelines, like it is the situation in Italy, what is missing to get there, to have open source as a really important or main drive of public sector modernization? What is the situation in Italy, Leonardo, and what are the main roadblocks preventing your administration from reap the full benefits of open source? You already mentioned some points in your introduction.
Yes, Monica. Well, as you mentioned, in Italy, we had this primary law, let's say, it's called the Code for Digital Administration, which was created, let's say, in the early 20s, 2003, 2004. So what happens is that many years passed, however, we didn't see the benefits coming from this primary law. So we started to question ourselves and try to understand what was the real blocker, what was the deal. And we understood that the primary law, it's really written in a way that is difficult to put it in action, to put it in practice. So in 2018, both the Department for the Digital Transformation, together with the Agency for Digital Italy, we created what is called a document that is called the Guidelines for the Acquisition and Reuse of Software inside the public administration. And those guidelines are really a way to, let's say, to make an interpretation of what the primary laws say and translate it into a practical action. So put it into practice and everyone can actually read it, follow it, and then make actions. This was the first, let's say, real deal. So we can see that from that moment on, from the publishing of those documents on, public administration started to understand what this is all about, right? So they started to put some software in an open source fashion. They start to draft new contracts with using our guidelines and so on. So of course, this is just one of the blockers, as you mentioned. The other one, I think, could be the discoverability of the solutions, because most of the times, and we used to have calls and talk with public administration on a daily basis, we get this question like, where do I find the software that I need? So again, the digital transformation team in 2017 started to think about how to find a solution. And what we have right now is repository, which is decentralized, and as Bastien mentioned before, is based on a public code specification that allows, in a very decentralized way, to grab all the free and open source software developed by public administration and made available to other administration. And this, again, is one little step going in that direction, so allowing other administration to understand what's going on and what solution can be reused.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So despite of the fact that you have very energetic, well-established so-called Team DigitALL in the past, now it's a department in the ministry, and you know, a lot of knowledge, experience, you serve as an example, but you have a lot of work on the ground, and you need to go to regions and talk to your counterparts and to basically raise awareness and show the direction.
Correct.
It's a lot of still to be done for all of us. Yanis, what is your take on this?
Oh, yeah. I think I would like to talk about the basic thing, which is understanding actually what the open source software is. I've seen like beautiful examples in Latvia, for example, building information system. And recently our CERT opened their pastelizer, which is for security threat identification, which is fully open source. And then talking to public servants and even politicians, I've seen cases where people even don't understand what it is. So I would say that education is one thing which it's not non-existent, but it actually could be more consistent, and you know, sometimes our politicians make a big change just by some of their decisions. So I would definitely start with educating them, and of course everyone wants to be involved. So I would say, yeah, that. Thanks.
So let's say you actually back up the point of raising awareness. Let's put it in this way. And it's also Leonardo mentioned that it's also important in still private sector. So you know, it's a everything is connected. It's one ecosystem. So it's important in all corners of the European open source ecosystem. Yanis, you also mentioned to me some time ago about the new legal initiative being prepared by VARAM, by Latvian Ministry on Environmental Protection and Regional Development. Two words on that?
Yeah, sure. Actually, maybe a couple of words about history. That several years ago, it was beginning of 2010s. Actually, open source was not on equal footing in public procurement, and then I'm proud to say that LATA, our association, worked hard together with VARAM to make it happen, that it is currently on equal footing, and currently guys are making even the next step to promote open source. It's actually still in works, so no promises here. But the idea is to put open source like a priority. So in public procurement, you will have to prove that open source doesn't work in this case. So let's see. Let's hope for this to happen soon here in Latvia.
So the principle open unless you
exactly
really have to justify, and it has to be very serious reason that you not do it, you need to open it. I'm going to be a bit provocative now, because do we need this type or any type of policy push? I already know an answer from some of you, but I can guess it. The policy push from the public sector, or shouldn't open source continue to be bottom-up, kind of a grassroots movement that grows organically without any regulation? Just Sashiko, short, briefly.
Yes, briefly.
Yes,
I think,
no?
you know, yes, I think we still need policy. And you said it yourself, Monica, the fact that adoption is is not at the equal level in each of the member states shows that there's still a lot of benefit for some countries to from open source. And, you know, Yanni said it, there is an important point about awareness raising. And I think in the private sector, no, open source doesn't need a handout. It's winning in the market. I think it's more about the public sector has a lot to gain itself from further adoption. So, you know, that would be my short point.
Thank you. So continuing on that, you, Sashiko, and your think tank participated in the study with some companies. The study was on the impact of open source and open hardware on the European economy, and this was commissioned by my colleagues from DG Connect. The results will be published soon, but the interim findings of the interim report were already revealed in February in one of the events on open source. And apart from confirming the enormous value that open source adds to the economy, the study also included a list of policy recommendations. Could you just choose two of them, tell us about them, the ones that you consider essential and implementable in the near future? So, you know, this is my can-do attitude. Let's focus on what is implementable.
Yes, indeed, Monica. Thank you. We're currently on a list of 30 recommendations, so you know it is difficult to choose just two, but two. So, but I would like to come back to the issue of procurement, and we don't necessarily have to talk about changing the regulatory environment. You know, Yanis mentioned this notion about thinking open source first. Well, it's not just about choosing an off-the-shelf product or service either. You know, we're talking about sharing, reuse. It's also about this notion that we can reuse and, you know, upcycle, innovate on top. And so there's one example I want to mention from recent history, which is the Belgian COVID tracing app that basically, you know, was put out for tender, and the winning bid actually was, building on the German open source app, and was able to reuse about 85% of the code, and then focus again on the rest, and adapting it to the local needs. And I think there we had a situation where it's a crisis and speed was really of the essence, and there was a cost saving as well. But really, it was about focusing on this innovative step. And so there are things we can do in public procurement to ensure that the public sector benefits, and also can work as a driver in the economy, because we have shown indeed that open source contributes to the economy, and that there's an opportunity for more open source to further grow the European economy. So there is an opportunity there. And then I would say, the other thing is still remains is about sort of current concerns around digital sovereignty. Bastien talked a lot about that. Is ultimately comes down to control. And I think we should be looking at how open source can really help the public sector to maintain this control, which is important. Yeah, so I would say those two things: public procurement and digital sovereignty. Yeah.
Out of the list of 12, yes.
30.
Let's wait. 30. Let's wait for the report.
Right.
Since it's already surfaced a couple of times, and also it's a recurring topic that digital sovereignty is at stake. So we should think about a decent coordination and governance of open source. And another recommendation from this report was on regarding open source program offices that maybe should be created established in public organizations. This was also picked up by the report of the French parliamentary mission led by French MEP Eric Bothorel on open data and open source software. Also suggested to creation such an office. By the way, the report is full of fantastic recommendations regarding open data and open source. In private sector, OSPO is becoming common practice, is gaining momentum in universities. Commission established its own open source program office as the first action when the new Commission open source strategy was adopted. Leonardo, is this way to go for other public administrations?
Oh, this is a good question. I think this is again the missing point. Again, thinking as I mentioned before in layers. So we started, at least in Italy, of course, so we started with a primary law, then we saw that we were missing something, so we drafted some guidelines, practical guidelines. And then we provided tools like the catalog of software, of open source software available for our administrations, but then looks like we're still missing something. And especially if we think that some member states are highly decentralized. So, for example, again, Italy, we have the national government, and then we have a lot of differences all over the territory. So maybe open source program offices, we may call it that way, we may call it, competence centers, as we do in Italy, can have this aggregation role. So they can really help local public administrations to understand what has to be done in order to fulfill what the law says, and also to provide, as we said, the return of investment and aggregate the requirements and find reusable solutions and so on and on. So I think that right now what we're doing in Italy is that we have a national open source program office, but many times we're not really able to reach what the real needs of local administration are. And so, from a regional level or from a city level. So I think that maybe open source program offices can help us to fill this gap and provide better solution for the future open source in the public sector.
So you would recommend establishing such offices or competence center that really show, even in the name, what is their role and purpose?
Exactly. I think this can be a good, a good approach, at least to try. And of course, we don't have to have, to make this creation of offices a burden in terms of bureaucracy. We need to make it as agile and as lean as possible in order to help the process and not create yet another block.
Yeah, we are sorry, talking about the open source way. So that means whatever we touch should be done in an agile way. It concerns also this aspect. Let me now move to go back actually to the main reason that we are today talking about open source, which is actually celebrating the achievements of two programs that are the funding is closed, but the actions are still ongoing, and also celebrating the transition to the Digital Europe program. And CEF building blocks and ISA solutions, are all open and reusable. They contribute to the open source ecosystem, enriching the public sector offering, helping companies digitalize their businesses, and making citizens' life simpler, especially like recently in the crisis such as the current pandemic. ISA Square program has also been supporting public administrations in adopting open source via initiatives such as sharing and reuse framework of IT solutions, JoinUp, a tool called JoinUp Licensing Assistant that supports licensing process and choice of open source license, open source observatory, or publishing the guidelines on sustainable communities in the public sector, organizing sharing and reuse awards for IT solutions from public administrations, and others. Not forgetting the IF with the very important principles of openness and reusability. So really a lot of focus on open source adoption in public sector. How could these initiatives evolve under the Digital Europe program? Because some actions of our program will be continued, and the question is how they could evolve under the Digital Europe program to help further strengthen the European open source ecosystem. Please share your ideas. Bastien, maybe you have some to share with me. I am very much interested.
Well, first of all, I would say that I'm a very happy European citizen right now, because that's really thanks to Europe that we are here right now, and to the two programs that you mentioned, that I've met Leonardo and that I will meet with Sashiko and Yanis soon. And that's really key into sharing good ideas. I think maybe the Blue Hats movements could have some kind of existence in Europe, and maybe the next steps are all about this. And to go back to the OSPO idea, I very much agree with what Leonardo said, and I would just add that the Botorel report insisted on the fact that we need to bring together the topic of consuming open source and publishing open source. So usually you can think of these two topics as different ones. One is about procurement and independence and so on. And the second one is more about open data and sharing with the citizens, but they are really connected. For example, if you are consuming, if your IT infrastructure is relying on some framework, then it makes no sense just using it without considering contributing to it, even just financially. So my great hopes for the future in general would be that Europe would be able to sponsor key infrastructure open source projects and foundations as part perhaps of a larger effort to finance digital commons, which are today integral to our shared digital infrastructures. My second hope would be to have Europe participate to the governance of big open source projects and foundations, be there the Free Software Foundation, the Mozilla Foundation, Linux Foundation, Eclipse Foundation. All these actors welcome companies, and they could welcome more people from the public sector. And I'm really looking toward this. And the third wish would be about being able to recruit open source leaders in the public sector and have the Europe help us with that. Because if we need to strengthen, to sustain the Blue Hats values, we need to have this open source and free software champion directly working within the administration and for the public sector. So 20 years ago, Europe took a very strong decision not to accept software patents. It needs to go toward using and publishing more free software with the same economical and ethical reasons than 20 years ago.
Thank you, Bastien, for these ideas. I noted down, and let's see how it evolves, but I share some of your hopes. And unfortunately, our time together is almost up. And I promise in the description of the session that we will also have a short exchange on the role of public sector in the open source environment. So we turn, this a bit upside down, although everything is connected. And actually, Bastien already mentioned that it's not a one-way street. It's about contributing and giving back to the communities. So as final thoughts, Sashiko, how the public sector can contribute to the strengthening and the growing of open source environment.
Yes, I know that we can't go over time, so I'll be super short. I actually want to almost reframe this question in the sense that it's important to recognize that that contributing actually bestows a benefit to the contributor. So it's not a question of charity, but it's an important way to actually gain skills. And I think this kind of exposure is very important. So contributing upstream actually, brings a benefit to those who contribute. I think that's an important point to make. Yeah, sorry.
No, thank you very much.
I'm just looking at the red, the timer ticking down.
Me too. That's why I encourage all that follow our session to ask you questions via Connect function. And I, with your heavy heart, I have to finish this session. And thank you all for your thoughts. And thank you for your work for the open source world. We all agreed that open source is vital for the published sector to flourish, and it has much to gain from using open source than the private sector. And it doesn't. It's not only about using; it's about being a full member of this environment that contributes, that thinks about the future. And we agreed that this is also best vehicle governments to engage and build the trustful relationship with its clients, which is the business and citizens. So let me finish with the best words that I heard in the recent date that our commissioner: the solutions of tomorrow must be built using public code. Thank you very much. I invite you, those of you that are interested in open source observatory. The session starts in a minute, the webinar, when we talk about this observatory and its work. Thank you once again. Have a nice sessions during 2 days of the event that left. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Monica, and dear panelists. This was brilliant. I would love to join, just to continue in the parallel session that you are starting now. And something that I read in the chat in parallel that came up was the question of how do we build a community? Something I remember we had, I think, a year or 1.5 years ago, a dedicated conference on this. How do we build the communities? And I think you, dear panelists together, you are an example of this community building that you already did and the spirit that we need to carry across Europe up to the local level, like also one of the colleagues in the chat said. I noted from each of the panelists one short sentence that struck me. Lots of sentences struck me, but let me say these only. Yanis said that open source is not only about tech, but it is actually about open government and the co-creative spirit of new government. This links us also into the afternoon. Sachiko said that open source is in particular about an power to innovate, and that this has been proven in the private sector, and now it is time for the public sector to just take it over. The contribution that we bring in gives us back skills and knowledge. I loved it. Bastien said accountability, and he stressed it very much, the accountability in the process and the maintenance idea around. You remember we had this issue in the SEMI conference last year. Maintenance is important because it builds resilience. Thank you, Bastien. And then Leonardo, who said, preaching is all fine, preaching is good, but we need to have clear guidelines. We need to have clear support tools, and of course, this links us to the OSPO concept. We return to many of these things, not least tomorrow in the GovTech discussions. And let me finish saying, I think what we heard here is the open source values are the values of 21st government tout court. So normally I would say hats off to the discussion, but here I'd rather say blue hats and other hats on. And we go back to Jen, who will introduce the next session, where we hear about the reuse of some of these open source tools.